And it's Ken Kraetzer for Sons of American Legion Radio. We're in Washington, D.C. today at the National Conference on Ministry to the Armed Forces, and we had a chance to talk with one of the speakers, and that is Cherie, who is president of the Trinity Forum Foundation, and gave a nice talk this morning on pluralism and persuasion, civil discourse amidst deep differences. Cherie, a very interesting presentation and very thoughtful about changes in civil discourse. What were some of the things that you've noticed has changed in recent years about the way people communicate with each other?
Well, thanks, Ken. I think almost everybody would believe that civil discourse has actually declined really quite dramatically in the last several years. You see it certainly not only in political campaigns, where it's been a very stark increase in civility, but really even across most forms of public conversation. The way we communicate with each other in social media, even the way we communicate with each other in the workplace. Workplace incivility is on the rise, schoolyard bullying is on the rise, and so there's been a problem with the way we talk to each other really across the board.
And one of the sources of this change that you expressed concerns about were social media, Facebook perhaps, which we use a lot of, but we think in a positive way, but some of the negativity that appears in social media today. Why do you see that? Why has that been such a factor?
Well, one is anonymous in social media, and so it's much easier to be insulting, rude, and demeaning if you're anonymous than if you're face-to-face with the person that you're insulting. There's also more of a sense of impunity with social media. Because you feel anonymous, you don't really feel like there's consequences for what you say. And third, and I think perhaps most significantly, is in many ways social media rewards extreme statements. You know, if you're insulting, if you're snarky, you're more likely to have people like what you say, listen to what you say, follow you, and the like. So essentially, there's positive reinforcement for snark that there's not for thoughtful ways of engaging.
And one of the anecdotes that you mentioned very powerfully was the value of telling stories and parables, as are often in religious texts. Why are stories and parables so valuable as a way to express a message in a positive way?
Well, we respond very differently to stories than we do to arguments or analysis. Stories engage the full mind, right brain as well as left brain, imagination and empathy, as well as reason and analysis. So if you're engaging with a story, it's hard to simply dismiss it or denounce it. It's a way of bringing people deeper into a conversation rather than just rebutting what the person has to say. It's also harder to feel threatened by a story because stories tend to be more complex, have more threads. You can't just run through it like you could an argument and rebut it point by point.
Absolutely. And you had a very compelling story about Dr. Martin Luther King, about how he wrote a letter while he was actually imprisoned. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, there's a fascinating story behind Letter from Birmingham Jail. I know there are many people who think that civility requires being sort of squishy, just polite, capitulating or accommodating when you shouldn't. And Letter from Birmingham Jail is one of these brilliant examples of how that is not the case. So Dr. King is in jail in Birmingham writing this letter on scraps of paper and even toilet paper. And it is a brilliant indictment of the injustice that is happening, which he does in an entirely civil manner and yet very hard-hitting. He makes an argument. He tries to persuade. And in addressing the more moderate clergy people of Birmingham who had not come to his side, he calls on Aquinas, Augustine, Niebuhr, other theologians, Bunyan, to make the case, to make his case. He does it in a brilliant way, in a thoughtful way, in a deeply civil way, but in a very hard-hitting way. And it's a great example of how to do it.
And glad to talk with Cherie, the president of the Trinity Forum here in Washington, a foundation. Tell us a little bit about your organization.
Oh, very gladly. So, Trinity Forum tries to provide a platform for the best of Christian thought leadership. We also try to provide a space and resources for leaders to grapple with the big questions of life in the context of faith. And we do that by having lectures and discussions, reading groups, we publish curricula and the like, basically to provide ongoing, you could call it classical executive education for people to grapple together with the big questions.
Very good. And you were kind enough to mention some nice thoughts about the American Legion Boys State and Girls State program. Tell us about the value you see in those programs.
I think they're terribly valuable. I went to Girls State and Girls Nation, actually became Girls Nation president in 1986. So I feel deeply grateful to the Legion for it. I think it is one of the most powerful, transformative ways to expose and introduce teenagers to the ideas behind our government, what sustains it, how our experiment in ordered liberty is sustained, what it means to be an American, the ways that civic engagement sustain the system. There's really not many other programs like it, if any at all. And so I feel deeply grateful to the Legion and the American Legion Auxiliary for sustaining both Girls State and Boys State over many decades.
Well, that is so terrific to hear. We feel exactly the same. That is one of the most valuable programs of the American Legion and the Auxiliary and the Sons. Cherie Harder, president of the Trinity Forum Foundation. Great to see you here in Washington. Great talk. Great to meet you.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Thank you. This is Ken Kraetzer in Washington, D.C. for Sons of the American Legion Radio at the National Conference on Ministry to the Armed Forces.